Good morning and welcome to the Dalí Museum. We are very happy to have so many people with us this morning. We knew this would be very popular and very crowded, so thank you for understanding. And I know we have the room next door is almost full as well, so we have a huge turnout. And of course, we are here for Duchamp, Dalí, Dalí, Duchamp. We have Dr. William Jeffett, who is our Curator of Special Exhibitions. He worked with esteemed art historian and art critic Don Addis, who's also with us. He will talk about his insights into the show, and then at the end there'll be a dialogue between the two of them. So you're here for a very special day. Please join me in welcoming William Jeffett.
Thank you. Also, at the end, there'll be an opportunity for questions, so we're not going to just turf you out when we finish the dialogue part. I'm going to very briskly walk you through the exhibition, and then, of course, you'll be seeing the real exhibition. There's an awful lot in it, so I probably won't dwell too much on individual things so as not to sort of bog us down too much, but I will pause occasionally on a couple of themes that crop up in the exhibition. I think the main point of it is that historically they were sort of seen as artists that really probably had nothing whatsoever to do with each other. And in fact, they were close friends, and they did have a lot to do with each other. And this is a very interesting kind of almost generational shift, but it's also to do, I think, with when artists die, a certain number of years go by before people can start to situate them in a kind of perspective. And Dalí died in 1989, and it took 10 or 15 years for people to start to sort of look at the work and see it maybe in a different light. And this is one of the most exciting sort of things that's come out of that sort of long process of sort of reevaluation and sort of understanding artists in more complex ways. So let's see. So here they are, and this is, we'll sort of start and end with this, but this is a point of contact they had in the 1960s when they were both filmed by Andy Warhol. They both knew Warhol. They both were interested in what was going on with younger art in the 1960s. And of course, they spent time together in that period as well. Duchamp, of course, was older than Dalí by about 17 years, and Duchamp died in 1968, so quite a bit before Dalí. And they came into direct contact with each other about 1930. So they're not constantly with each other. There are different moments when they tend to spend more time together. So they probably met in Paris, like I said, around 1930, 1933. Duchamp, together with Man Ray, goes down to Spain to visit Dalí in Cadaqués, and they go to Barcelona as well. And Man Ray sort of brought down, with the help of Duchamp, in order to photograph Art Nouveau buildings in Barcelona for an article Dalí was preparing for Minotaur, the Surrealist magazine in Paris. And here's Dalí with Duchamp, Gala, and others on the beach of Cadaqués in 1933. Again in 1958, Duchamp begins to summer in Cadaqués. So he spends every summer between 1958 and 68 there, and he spends quite a lot of time with the Dalís. And here we can see them all together, and there's a series of photos that are in the exhibition. This is also the same year that Dalí acquired a work by Duchamp that eventually is in his theater museum in Figueres, the Boîte en Valise, which we'll see later. Another moment of contact is in 1961 in Figueres. Duchamp helps Dalí stage this elaborate surreal bullfight, which was a real bullfight, but also had a kind of surrealist bit to it. This is the sort of one of the sort of poster announcements for it, with a Dalí drawing in it. Dalí had been speculating about this for a decade or so. Here's the review in one of the Spanish papers. And this is what the poster looked like, the sort of large version, which is in the foundation in Figueres. Dali's idea was that, one of his ideas is that at the end, the bull would be kind of airlifted out of the ring by a helicopter, and that's what's going on in the lithograph. He's sort of dropped into the poster. And there he is with the poster in the house in Port Legat before it was moved to, later on to the Teatro Museo. And then, of course, Duchamp was there orchestrating all of this, and they sat together during the bullfight, and Man Ray was there as well. And at the end of it, there was this sort of happening, which was a self-destructing bull made out of fireworks that exploded. And this was done by Niki de Saint-Phal and Jean Tinguely, two younger artists associated with things like happenings in the early 1960s. Very, very sort of important. One is French, the other is Swiss. They were a couple. And it was Duchamp that brought them in to conceive of this and to kind of orchestrated that part of it. So they collaborated at various points in their career. And this is the one piece that we sort of wanted for the exhibition. It's just a little thing. It's only the size of a sheet of paper. But it's the frontispiece of a book that the first monograph, important monograph about Duchamp from 1958. And they both sign it. And they're playing around with sort of a sense of authorship and identity. And there's a thumbprint on it, so this kind of signing it establishes the authenticity, and it's very ambiguous, where Dalí stops and Duchamp begins, and so on. So it's quite an interesting little item. It's in the catalog and in our brochure, but it's not in the exhibition. We were very lucky to get most of the things we were after. So we're very happy about that. Both artists were very photogenic and understood the importance of photography, and were photographed by some of the finest photographers of the 20th century, and sometimes the same ones, like Man Ray. They really played with this, and this became part of their sort of sense of identity. And even though Duchamp is sort of famous for being a kind of very discreet, reserved person, he was very visible in photography, and even in the press. I mean, here we see he goes to New York. He's still fairly young, and he goes to New York, and Vanity Fair does a little article about Duchamp arrives in New York City. And there he is in the middle of the photograph with other members of his family, including his brother, who went by the name Duchamp Villon, and who died from an illness contracted during the First World War. So he had a very short career. Duchamp's siblings, there were 6 children, and 4 of them were artists. Another thing that unites the two of them is that very early on they saw this performance, a very strange play that's sort of based on puns and wordplay and sort of elaborately constructed sentences. It's kind of almost nonsense thing, and yet it's an extraordinary kind of linguistic experiment called Impressions of Africa. And Duchamp saw this, as did several other friends of his, and of course Dalí was too young to have seen it in Paris. And it's a kind of story set in colonial Africa, and it's quite sort of crazy, but this sense of wordplay united both of them. Of course, Dalí later on did this famous painting, another one that is not in the exhibition, that's called Impressions of Africa. So it directly goes back to that. But this idea of punning is very related to Dalí's double images. Of course, they were both intimately involved with Surrealism, and for Breton, Duchamp was the most intelligent and for many the most disturbing man of the first half of the 20th century. The exhibition is divided into themes. Number 1 is a sort of explores the concept of identity, how they play with identity, how they engage with painting and also challenge painting. Second section about games, that's why we have the programming around games, and I'll come back to that. Science and religion, and the body and the object, which is also about eroticism. It's very sort of discreet to call it the body and the object. Anyway. They showed together throughout the 1930s and also later on in various sort of international exhibitions of surrealism. And Duchamp often was a kind of orchestrator of these things. So Breton trusted Duchamp quite a lot and had him involved in creating these elaborate sort of environments. And so in the 1938 exhibition, there's this coal-sack ceiling and this very strange environment. It's very unlike normal picture presentation with sort of illuminated braziers that suggested fire and very kind of dark, oppressive sort of atmosphere. You can see here one section of it. And I'll come back with some other images, and you can see how the paintings were shown kind of rather sort of squeezed in. Those are Tongis in that photo. And there were mannequins, a kind of street of mannequins, or corridor of mannequins. Each of the different artists in the exhibition dressed a mannequin. And of course, this is the exhibition where Dalí did the rainy taxi. And here you can see on the left, the Dalí mannequin, and on the right, the Duchamp. The Duchamp one, with his alter ego, Rose C'est la vie, I'll come back to her, but he created this feminine alter ego. And this is sort of how we were trying to set it up in London, and we have something similar here, you'll see. But though they were connected with surrealism and even in Duchamp in particular with Dada and various strands of anti-art, they also were both painters and engaged with different types of languages of painting when they were younger and went through different sort of transitions. Both of them painted portraits of their fathers. Both of their fathers were notaries from provincial cities and sort of well-heeled bourgeois families. And they came from a sort of relatively privileged background, which allowed them probably to be artists. They did not have to wake up and go to work in a factory in the morning. Both of them went through cubist phases. And Duchamp was very interested in modern science and also was a great aficionado of chess. And this painting is called the King and Queen Surrounded by Swift Nudes. And it's partially pointing to chess references and also to ideas of science and electricity and so on and so forth. But this kind of painting also introduced movement into Cubism, which had been kind of rather sort of static. In fact, still life and portraiture were two of the main sort of kind of subjects of most Cubism. And when he showed these paintings, they were kind of shocking because of the introduction of that. And we'll see when we get on to Dalí's painting that he also introduced kind of disturbing modern features as a young artist. Here you can see the fathers a little more clearly, the one on the right, the Dalí, and the one on the left, the Duchamp. Dalí playing around with a slight kind of neoclassical language, and Duchamp a bit more with Fauvism and post-impressionist languages. Of course, Dalí could paint landscapes and did paint landscapes, and the landscapes around Caracas were important. Here's a piece where Duchamp is painting a coffee mill and suggesting its movements, which, already, even though he hasn't sort of left aside painting, which he will do later, he's pointing to the idea of us being engaged with it. Its motion also suggests that we might sort of, at least metaphorically and visually, be spinning that handle of the coffee grinder. We've chosen in the Cubism of Duchamp to focus on the chess subjects because it's a point of contact between the two of them. So here we have Duchamp's chess players on the right and Dalí's Cubist self-portrait, which involves collage, which Dalí often sort of corrupted painting by putting other things into it. And that continues to be important and an important sort of point of contact between them. Here's the detail of that painting. It was shown with the famous nude descending a staircase in the Armory in 1913. Here's the other painting, which is not in the exhibition, but it was sort of scandalous when these sort of, again, movement and motion, it really sort of disturbed people enormously. at the time. And of course, Dalí could also look at things from a realist point of view, but a realist point of view that involves sort of painting as if it were almost a photograph. So he's thinking about mechanical modes of reproduction as he approaches painting gradually during the late 1920s, which leads us to the sort of second theme of this first section of the exhibition, which is this idea of challenging painting. Now, Duchamp claimed to have given up painting around 1923 in order to dedicate himself intensely to play chess. He was not interested in sort of working for a living, and certainly not in having to paint paintings in order to make a living. So in 1919, he decided to draw a mustache and goatee on a sort of postcard reproduction of the Mona Lisa. And this got reproduced sort of fairly rapidly and became a kind of important sort of transgressive icon. And it's called L-A-S-H-O-Q, letters of the alphabet pronounced in French, which pun and suggests she has a hot ass. So he also came back to this over and over again, and there are various different versions of it. So he did one in 1930, another one in 1958 in Caracas, which is the one we have in the exhibition, that belonged to, in the past, to a very famous Catalan artist, Antoni Tapias, of the next generation down from Dalí. He also did variants of it, like this one. It's the Mona Lisa shaved, so he's sort of removed the facial hair. And you'll see there's a little one in there. I'm not going to show you now, where you just see only the goatee and the mustache without the Mona Lisa. So he played around with this idea quite a lot, and of course, so did Dalí. Later on, but Dalí sort of Dalineized the Mona Lisa. And there's a kind of these games sort of slightly masculinize the Mona Lisa as well, and sort of drew out ambiguous elements of this mysterious painting and suggested that they were she maybe had sort of more masculine qualities than one normally associates with the painting. And then Duchamp created this sort of alter ego figure, and he got Man Ray to sort of photograph him on more than one occasion, dressed up as Rose c'est la vie, which pronounced in French sounds like Eros c'est la vie, or Eros, that's life. So this is one of those, and this is another one. And these did also get reproduced, so there were the photographs and occasionally reproductions. So Duchamp played around with his self-image quite a lot. And this particularly curious one, which also relates to our, we've got it in this section, but it does actually relate to the sort of games and play section. The Monte Carlo Bond, that's Duchamp in the middle, and he's got sort of soap all over his face, and his hair is kind of sticking up like a kind of devil's horns. And he had this scheme he came up with, because, like I said, he liked chess, and he convinced a couple of sponsors that if they gave him money, he would go to Monte Carlo, and that he was sort of working on a system where he could sort of make money, and then they would cut the coupons, and he would pay them, 200 francs for each coupon, and that he would approach roulette and baccarat, the two main games they played in Monte Carlo, from a sort of more systematic point of view, as if he were applying the rules of chess to roulette. Didn't work out too well, but he got bored also down there, and wrote letters back to one of his big patrons, Jacques Doucet, a major collector and couturier. So Dalí too kind of challenges painting, and he, through his fascination with photography, and he ends up doing these very, very odd paintings, and we have some in our collection as well, and this is one from the Reina Sofia in Madrid, very sort of austere paintings with very odd images, and they seem to be the absolute antithesis of painting, and this is at the height of his interest in film and photography. He's thinking about going to Paris to work with Buñuel on Chien Andalou. He's writing articles about photography and so on. And he goes to Paris, and he kind of comes back to painting, but it's very different. and it has collage and photographic elements. And this painting, which is ours, was shown in an exhibition of collages in Paris in the spring of 1930, which also included Duchamp and various other artists, but Duchamp's Mona Lisa collages were there, and so here they're exhibiting together for the first time, though they may not have met yet in the spring of 1930. It may have been later in the year at the showing of the L'Âge d'Or. So here's a photo taken in the 60s of the two of them playing chess. Dalí was probably not as good a chess player as Duchamp. Duchamp was a champion chess player, maybe not quite of the highest order, but close to the highest order, and a really passionate chess player. They both also, later on, Duchamp created this sort of miniaturization of all his works in a kind of valise, and Dalí did a valise piece that has all these quite sort of optical double image pieces in it, which is probably inspired by the Duchamp one. And you can see that this is the boîte en valise. It's sort of all the paintings of Duchamp kind of miniaturized, reproduced, and little tiny miniature reproductions of his three-dimensional works. The Dalí with its sort of pop-up images and double images and anamorphic distortions. And of course, chess was something the Surrealists were very interested in. Dalí designed a chess set in homage to Marcel Duchamp, which you can see in the exhibition alongside a chess set that belonged to Duchamp that he used when he was younger and that he played chess with his brothers. So the Surrealists had a great interest in games in general, and they invented all sorts of odd games like the Cadaver Ski, which were kind of collaborative drawings, or a Surrealist set of postcards, or a kind of Surrealist set of something like the tarot cards, but sort of serialized. When they did that in Marseille, when they were waiting to sort of come to America at the time of the war. And like I said, Duchamp was a really great chess player, and he became increasingly steeped in the idea of chess around 1917 when he spent several months in Buenos Aires in Argentina. And down there he also commissioned an artisan to design a chess set for himself. That's what it looks like. It's not the chess set we have here. We have an antique French set that he had before he went to Buenos Aires in the exhibition. Here's one that's designed by Man Ray. Here's a shot from René Clair's film Entre Actes in 1924 showing Duchamp and Man Ray playing chess. Another shot of Duchamp playing chess with the Comte Raoul de Roussy. Like I said, he starts to play chess intensively around 1922-23, especially until 1933, sort of at in serious international competitions. And in 1925, he designs this poster for the French championship. Another photo of him playing chess. He also read a sort of important theoretical book that was co-authored with Halberstadt about the end game in 1932. It describes a kind of strange situation at the end of a chess game if you only have each side only has 2 or 3 pieces left on the board, and it's not clear how to win and how they kind of move around trying to avoid losing pieces. It's a kind of strange problem that doesn't come up frequently in normal competition. It's a very sort of dense theoretical work. And then, perhaps less well known, he either translated or contributed to the French version of an important famous book by Zanosko-Borowski that is about the opening phase of the chess game, how to play the chess openings. So he was very knowledgeable on a theoretical level about chess, apart from his sort of passion as a player, notations that he did about chess diagrams. And like I said, he shared this with others. There are many references to chess throughout Surrealism. There's this group of photos of the different members of the Surrealist group laid out as a kind of chessboard, and many of them designed these chess sets as well. So Max Ernst, chess set, Ernst with his wife playing chess. Again, him with his chess set, Calder. Duchamp did a pocket chess set in 1944, kind of miniature multiple, and it's considered a work of art. And here's Man Ray with Duchamp playing chess. And then at the time of his retrospective, his sort of the first important one at the Pasadena Art Museum, he played chess with Ava Babitz, who was a kind of socialite in the sort of cultural world of LA at the time, in the middle of the gallery. So you can see the large glass in the background, or playing with cage in a kind of happening involving music, a wired chess set, and so on. So it's a huge element of his work. And here are a couple of other shots of different examples of the Dalí chess set. So the idea of that was to raise money for the American Chess Federation. And Duchamp was on the board of the American Chess Federation and sent letters out to people saying, please make donations, and it's tax deductible, it's very beneficial, and it's a good cause, and things like that. So it's quite interesting, his interest in sort of an understanding of the American tax system. For somebody as sort of anti-system as he seems to have been. So in the section on science and religion, which is a kind of big core section of the exhibition, we have a different version, but we have the representation of the large glass that's in Philadelphia, and that version in Philadelphia, which is the first version, can't be lent. So there are a couple of other versions out there in the world. We have the one from Stockholm. In London, they have this one from the Tate. But it's too fragile to travel on the airplane. So we had to juggle a few important pieces like that. These are some of the views of how it was presented in London. So in this section, we also have films that involve just optical approaches. Dalí's Spellbound and Duchamp's Anemic Cinema, which is a kind of these spiraling optical illusions. Great paintings like double image paintings like the painting from the Wadsworth Athenaeum in Hartford. It's just that one there, it's a great privilege to have it here. And this idea of optical illusion, double images, and the interest they had in language and puns are quite closely related. So just as in a pun, a word can mean more than one thing. In Dalí's paintings, an image can mean more than one thing. So this one also has a kind of anecdotal interest. This is another moment of point of contact, and in Arcachon, at the time of the German occupation, they both ended up there together. And Dalí was painting, and Gala was playing chess with Duchamp. And Dalí painted this painting. The two crusts of bread are meant to be Gala and Dalí, and the chess piece is meant to be Duchamp, the sort of intruder. So that was these kind of moments when they were spending time together. Of course, the interest in physics is important. Heisenberg and all of this sort of quantum theory that becomes so significant for Dalí, and Duchamp, of course, engaged with science, but also questioning it with this sort of chance-derived idea of dropping a string a meter long from a meter height, and then having sort of a variance of the meter. So the meter was not an absolute. So science and measurement, systems of thought, whether they're religious or philosophical, could be sort of challenged and seen to be much more fluid than maybe they're assumed in history. And of course, Dalí's engagement with direct engagement with religious iconography, Duchamp's large glass, which is suggests a kind of mechanical relationship between the male sort of more perspectival figures below and the sort of female figure above who's meant to sort of be put into operation by the mechanism of the male, and then she sort of blossoms in a kind of erotic flowering or deflowering, and that's the sort of general drift of the thing. It has some more detailed iconography, but I think it's probably better not to linger over that. And he also had all these notes. So again, textuality that is so important. So these notes are sort of a guide to how we might interpret that series of images going on in the glass. And we have a selection of these. These were published read the notes on little scraps of paper and then made elaborate facsimiles. And then published it in an edition in 1934. And there are various other notes. We have some other ones as well, which are sort of a key to that mysterious piece and also to Duchamp in general. So the great Christ of St. John of the Cross, which very provocatively has a kind of above and below sphere. The above seems more masculine, and it's very sort of vertical, and the area below is more of a landscape and more horizontal, and the figure above is more in the foreground, and the landscape has much more depth. So he's also playing around with these different zones of human experience. And Dalí's famous Sistine Madonna, which touches the theme of optics and optical illusions, but also makes reference to Raphael's Madonna and to a photo of the Pope's ear. And this was in a Surrealist exhibition curated by Duchamp in 1960 and provoked great hostility on the part of the Surrealists because though Dalí was meant to be in the show, the Surrealists were very anti-clerical and they did not approve of the religious subject matter, and so they wrote a manifesto criticizing Dalí's absolutely unacceptable sort of engagement with it. There's a Wadsworth painting again, and examples of these these optical rotary discs, which are meant to move around and have a kind of player, like a kind of record turntable where they spin around. And he had other experiments he'd done along the same lines in the 1920s. Again, he got his sponsors to bankroll them. And then the last section is about Surrealist objects and Duchamp's idea of the ready-mades. And this is a point where they, in the 30s, really overlapped in Surrealist exhibitions, one of which was the exhibition of Surrealist objects in 1936. And you can see in the middle of this photograph, Duchamp's bottle rack, for example, and just to its right, a little Why Not Sneeze, which is a kind of bird cage with marble sugar cubes in it, and Dalí's famous aphrodisiac jacket. So there was a sort of way the Surrealists showed things. They jumbled everything up and they established relationships that you wouldn't see if you kind of isolated things. So we've tried to recreate that. Again, you can see the coal-sack ceiling, and in the back right-hand area of the thing, you can see one of Dalí's paintings, for example. And then there was this idea of the ready-made, and that exhibition had a catalog that was called Abridged Dictionary of Surrealism. And here you have a dictionary entry of the ready-made with the bottle rack and the sugar cube piece called Why Not Sneeze. So we sought to recreate that here and in London by devising a kind of vitrine that could sort of keep that feeling of the pieces that were in that 1936 exhibition. Duchamp once asked in one of his notes, "Can one make works that are not works of art?" So the idea is he was selecting these ordinary objects and kind of baptizing them as works of art by signing them. And in the dictionary, it's described as an ordinary object elevated to the dignity of a work of art by the mere choice of an artist. So He didn't make many of these. He only made around 13 over 30 years. So here's the detail of the bottle rack. This is a sort of wine bottle drying rack, typical object in France. So you just go along and buy it anywhere. And then he made some others that are slightly modified found objects, like the bicycle wheel, which he liked to spin and watch in his studio. And some of them were less well known early on. There were things he just did, but they weren't like sort of necessarily seen in exhibitions, and yet they sort of became very famous. These sort of very curious objects, let's say. Or this one in advance of a broken arm, sort of snow shovel bought in a hardware store, that he then hung in his studio. This is an ordinary comb that he's written sort of fine words on it, sort of language transforming it. Or this one with hidden noise, which has inside of it there's an unknown object. He asked Arensberg, one of his patrons, to put something in there, and it's basically remained a secret ever since. And it also has words on it. But probably the most famous is the fountain that was he presented for exhibit in New York, and this was meant to be an open exhibition with no criteria, that nothing was meant to be rejected. That he sort of got a friend of his to sort of cart it over to the exhibition, and it was signed R. Much, so he didn't put his own name on it, and it discreetly didn't get put on view. So carefully went back and rescued it, carted it over to Stieglitz's studio, and the photographer who then photographed it, and it was published in a sort of Dada journal called The Blind Man. Here it is, and since then it's been very famous. So most of these things were remade later on. Originals don't exist, and he came back to them in the 1960s and made editions, very carefully and meticulously fabricated. So here's his defense of that piece. Whether Mr. Mutt made the fountain with his own hands or not has no importance. He chose it. He took an article of life, placed it so that its useful significance it disappeared under the new title, and point of view created a new thought for that object. Air of Paris, so it's a kind of pharmacy kind of container that's meant to have Paris air inside of it. And the Fresh Widow, this one's not in the exhibition, but this one's interestingly signed he signed it Rose C'est la vie, he didn't sign it Marcel Duchamp. That's the sugar cube piece. It's got a sort of whalebone in it and a thermometer. And partially the idea is that it looks lightweight, but it's actually very heavy because the sugar cubes aren't sugar, they're marble. Which actually Dalí has, when he came back to refabricate his Surrealist object, he has little sugar cubes in it that are also made out of like granite or whatever. It's kind of interesting parallelism. Dalí's sort of approach to the Surrealist object, like some of the other Surrealists, slightly younger than Duchamp, wanted to invest these strange objects with a kind of sense of fetishism and eroticism. And they were, of course, very fascinated with Freud, the lobster telephone. Duchamp also, later on, made these kind of odd erotic objects, erotic sculptures, like this one, the female fig leaf. We have a plaster version of it that's painted so that it looks like bronze, but he did actually come back and make a bronze edition of it later on. His strangest late work is in the Philadelphia Museum. It's another thing that can't travel. It's a kind of environmental installation. And he created a kind of scenography where you look through a peephole of a sort of barnyard door, and you see this scenario, and you see this. I'll show you what it looks like. So these are studies leading up to it that he did, and so during this phase when he was meant not to be working at all, he was quietly working on this, but nobody knew about it except Dalí, Duchamp's dealer, and one or two other people. It was a secret, and after Duchamp died, it was unveiled at the Philadelphia Museum. And everybody was very surprised because everybody assumed he'd just simply stopped doing things, though he was making all those multiples during the 1960s. So this door, which probably comes from a farmhouse somewhere in Catalonia, it has this sort of peephole, and when you look through the peephole, you see that. So this is also, in some ways, it's a kind of tableau vivant equivalent to the very abstract image of the bride and the bachelors in the glass, but this, I suppose, we're in the position of the sort of bachelor, and we're viewing the bride, as it were, through the peephole, and it's got this elaborate background. And Dalí helped Duchamp conceive the background because Dalí had great expertise with printmaking. So, I mean, it's an elaborate thing. That's what it sort of would look like if it wasn't sort of, hidden. It's got this sort of room behind it, as it were. And this is what the collotypes that Dalí helped Duchamp with looked like. There are 2 or 3 of them, but there's one that has Dalí's handwriting on it, so we know Dalí was aware of this project and probably was helping out Duchamp, as Duchamp helped Dalí out. I don't have a slide of it, but the Venus de Milo with drawers is the original plaster done in 1936. Duchamp helped Dalí out with the technical part. And of course, Dalí, and probably we don't need to dwell on it at great length, was also interested in eroticism in painting and in drawing in other areas. And without showing many of them, we could end on that little footnote and see that sometimes there are little phallic references in Dalí, like Meditation on the Harp, where he's got a kind of phallic arm extension, or Catalan bread, which changes one's view of eating bread in Catalonia forever. And from the Foundation in Figueres, the famous William Tell and Gradiva, where you have the sort of father William Tell, he sequestered Gradiva from the now absent castrated son figure and is having his pleasure with her. And so just to conclude, to summarize, coming back to our sort of Warholian images of the 2 of them sort of statically sitting there in front of the camera doing nothing because it was a screen test and they were just meant to sit there for 5 minutes doing nothing. A couple of quotes to end on, which we think are pretty good, to help sort of sum it up. I force myself to contradict myself in order to avoid conforming to my own taste. And that was one of the ideas of the ready-mades, that they were sort of in between. They were sort of anartistic, and he talked about the beauty of indifference. And so they were meant to be sort of neither one thing or the other, but they certainly weren't meant to change. They weren't exactly meant to change something that wasn't art into art. They were sort of meant to avoid the category of art. And then he says also, I don't believe in art, I believe in artists, something I'm sure Dalí would have agreed with. And Dalí, for example, said, I cannot be accused of practicing modern painting. And surely both of them were challenging not just painting, but modern painting in particular throughout their career, and hopefully the show demonstrates that. So I'd like to invite Dawn up, and let's chat for a few minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions. So there is much more to be said, but hopefully the exhibition in the catalog will help you explore the details. But let's.
That was great, and I expect now, really, William has whetted your appetite to get up there and see the exhibition, because there is so much to look at there and to think about. Very briefly, because I'm sure we shouldn't go on for too long, but it might be interesting to reflect a little bit on the origins of the exhibition, on how it came about at all. And of course, it's by no means the only exhibition that has paired 2 artists, 2 or 3 artists. Indeed, you had here Dalí and Picasso not so very long ago. There was a wonderful exhibition of Picasso and Braque, looking at their Cubist period. But on the whole, those sort of exhibitions have been bringing together 2 artists who are known to have had connections, usually stylistic ones. So it's been examining their art, with parallels that you can really see. In the case of Dalí and Duchamp, it's not really like that. And the question for us was really how to do it. I think we both became interested in the relationship at least 15 years ago, probably a bit more. And it wasn't at all obvious how one might go about exploring it. So it's been a kind of risk, and it's been a risk that has really, I think, wonderfully justified itself, because all kinds of connections came out as we were doing research. I think that's...
I think so. I mean, those photos on the beach weren't known, and they came because we were looking for things like that. We found them.
And you know, it's not a matter, this exhibition, of putting together, on the whole, two works and saying, you know, look at the similarities. There is a whole range, I think, of ways in which these two artists are pursuing some kind of parallel route, but they are still very different. I mean, we didn't want the exhibition to deny those differences. So it's a mixture of bringing together and trying to create a spark from the contact of these extremely different sort of things, like an electron, a neutron, or whatever it might be, and looking at very, very similar approaches to the world in general. And one thing I think we should emphasize, because it's more difficult to show it in an exhibition, but it's one that you might reflect on and read more about, is the fact that they were both obsessed with words, with poetry, with language. And this is a really important aspect, I think, of their work, and one that really, you know, opens up another avenue for us to explore in future.
Yes, I mean, and it's kind of a huge, and it's hard to show in an exhibition in some ways. I mean, we've pointed to it with manuscripts and texts and things, but it's harder to show this because Dalí was obviously a kind of major writer in lots of ways.
He was a major writer, and you could really draw very interesting parallels between Dalí's what he called his psychoanalytical essay on Millé's Angelus, the tragic myth of Millé's Angelus, which was written in 1933-34, the same year that Duchamp published the notes for his large glass, the green box notes, same year, which is actually quite interesting. But you can see both of them as, you know, having an extremely interesting relationship with their visual work. It's not just a matter of sort of the text describing the visual work. It's as if there's a kind of coming together, a kind of, you know, a way of generating ideas and images by bringing together the visual and the verbal. Is that something like that?
I think so, yes.
Because, of course, the tragic myth of Millé's Angelus is the kind of base for a whole series of Dalí paintings of different kinds, including the Meditation on the Harp.
Including that one.
Including that one. And, of course, the notes to the large glass and the other notes are not only the origin of the bride stripped bare by her bachelors, even the large glass, but also of that very peculiar last work, the room, called Étant donné, or given. So that's just one, seems to me, extremely rich area that has been opened up by looking at the two of them together.
Well, and I suppose also Dalí starts to sort of think about remaking some of these sort of surrealist objects around the time Duchamp is doing his editions in '64. And of course, from '58 to '68, they're spending all those summers together.
Yes.
And it's interesting that sort of happens at the same time. And of course, Dalí's a bit more sporadic maybe than Duchamp in that regard, because he carries on doing that into the early '70s. But
I think there are connections like that I mean, like the Venus appearing the same year as the replicas of the ready-mades. Just one thing about this, which is a real difference between them, looking at the Meditation on the Harp there, which is one of the series from the tragic myth of Millé's Angelus. One thing that Duchamp did not share was an interest in Freud. He was not, at least on the surface, interested in psychoanalysis, whereas Dalí was. But in other ways, they share so many interests in scientific and other kinds of changes in ideas in the 20th century.
They were, I mean, they both were incredibly well read and had, you know, at least taken a stab at reading sort of fairly advanced books on, in the case of Duchamp, both mathematics and science, and Dalí especially physics and Einstein, quantum theory, Heisenberg, things like that. I mean, It's hard to know to what degree they truly understood these things, but they certainly went further than other people did, I think, in terms of attempting to kind of grasp it. It seems like they both had sort of pretty good background in mathematics, which Dalí would have needed to make his compositions.
Yes, and I think they found uniquely original ways to express these new ideas. I don't think any other artist in the 20th century comes anywhere near either of them from that point of view.
Yeah, so the others have more superficial knowledge and probably had read sort of simplifications of these books and also just end up illustrating it more than maybe engaging with the ideas inside their work. I mean, it's more like just anecdotal.
Yes, and just one last thing, I think we ought to open it up to questions, but the very last quotation that William showed, Dalí saying he couldn't be accused of practicing modern painting. And we've been discussing together this question of their relationship to modernity, modernism, the modern tradition in painting, and it's, in a way, we both feel they're outside the modernist tradition in painting, and even challenging, in some ways, modernity itself, but we seem to be in a minority from this point of view.
Yes, and that sort of modern painting understood as sort of formal experimentation like Cubism, and there were quite a lot of Cubist artists, not just Picasso and Braque, but there were dozens of other ones. Some of them are less exciting. And some of them were also interested in science, but I think by the time Dalí comes on the scene, Cubism has kind of played its course out, because I mean it starts sort of around 1909, and it's still very much on the sort of cultural landscape through the 20s, but by the end of the 20s it's sort of quite exhausted, and the younger artists are, they've lived through the war, they've had a different experience, and they are thinking about different things. I mean, that's sort of why, how surrealism and related positions come about is because they're starting to think about, well, are there other questions other than how to approach still life painting from a kind of different way than they did in the 19th century. And they're assimilating all, by then also film and photography are becoming kind of quite important and widespread, so they're engaging with that as well. And Freud comes to be very popular in the mid-1920s and is becoming translated into many different languages. I suppose that's all a factor in this sort of shift away from Cubism and things related to, like abstract painting related that come out of Cubism in a way. Which they didn't like much.
No, I think that's true. And I mean, insofar as it's obviously it's a crude sort of caricature in a sense of what happened in the 20th century to painting. But if one sees it as at least partially a kind of battle between abstraction and figuration, the Surrealists were certainly on the side of figuration in a way, and not that Surrealism was ever a style. But in that way, both of these, both Duchamp and Dalí, would align themselves on that side, wouldn't they?
Yes, and maybe they sort of point away from painting because sometimes sort of people who are more interested in just painting, just the history of painting, might, or some people might, sort of say, well, who are the two greatest painters or artists even of the 20th century? And they might say Picasso and Matisse. And while I think Picasso might be very important for both Dalí and Duchamp, I think Matisse is totally off the map for them.
I think that's a good point to open it up to questions.
Yes, let's have questions. I'm sure you must have some.
Would you expand on your idea that you had you and William are supporting a minority view of Duchamp and Dalí's relation to modernism, and also explain what the majority view might be?
Well, actually, I'm going to turn that question over to William, because we were just talking just before this event about that last quotation of Dalí's, which comes from his essay on Marcel Duchamp called "The King and Queen Traversed by Swift Nudes," and we were just saying, well, we've held this view that the two of them stand outside and indeed challenge the tradition of modernist painting. But William had an experience of talking to one of the Spanish art historians who found this extremely puzzling. Do you want to?
Yes, he seemed to think that, no, Dali's very modern. But I think it was, I think what he meant is that Dali's very modern because he's interested in mass culture, like cinema and photography. The cinema being like a kind of, huge transformation of the cultural landscape, rather than modernism in the sense of formal experimentation, or the idea of progress in painting, or these kind of, like the Russian or like Mondrian, these artists that were looking at abstraction, or this kind of more academic kind of cubism that was so widespread.
I mean, in a way, it's obviously quite difficult to justify. Sorry, I keep turning away from this. To justify the claim that they're in some way sort of oppositional to modernity, but to modern painting, I think one can say that they're definitely outside it. But one can't deny that Duchamp in particular has been a hugely influential figure in terms of opening up other materials for artists to work with. He talks about painting being a 500-year-old tradition, oil painting on canvas, that's really had its day, in his view, and that it should be possible for younger artists to explore other avenues. And he talks about light. So what he's got in mind, obviously, is photography and film. But he's clearly also opening it up in all kinds of other ways to other materials, such as the ready-made. And that has had an incalculable influence on contemporary art. So I suppose in a way, it may be that it was a particular attitude in the 20th century towards the necessity of progress, some way, and the realization of some sort of technical utopia, where I think they were both skeptical, and that's.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose just historically, there was the assumption that sort of Duchamp was an artist about ideas and not so much about painting, and Dalí was a painter who had no interest in ideas. And what I think the exhibition shows is that Dalí did have ideas. Even if he carried on painting, he tried to make painting that had ideas in it. And he also was a significant writer. And Duchamp also, though he was interested in ideas, was also interested in how to, he came back over and over again and remade all these pieces that he had done meticulously in a very sort of crafted way, or had somebody make them in a crafted way, but he wasn't uninterested in how things were made. So this kind of stereotype that was there sort of breaks down, I think.
He admits in one of his interviews with a bit of a chuckle, he said, this is Duchamp, after all, I am a meticulous man. And the making of things, if you look at them, is very meticulous.
Well, that's probably comes with being a chess player.
Could you expand just a bit on the ready-made's influence on present-day found in conceptual art?
Well, broadly speaking, I think it allowed younger artists to use kind of anything, any kind of material or process in their work, especially I think during the 1970s, maybe even in the 60s to some degree, but especially from the 70s onwards, artists could make pieces that used processes as opposed to a kind of more fixed idea, or they could choose objects and incorporate it in. And plus this idea of installation, which in some ways Duchamp was the father figure of, and Dalí as well, to create an environment, or so these are things that are sort of normal now, but were probably strange when they first came on the landscape, and I think he sort of permitted artists to sort of do that.
Have you, in your research, heard anything about Armat being the name of the man who cast the fountain in the first place? Did you run into that anywhere? Because somebody
Oh, there's been a huge amount of speculation about that. And Duchamp himself said that it was nothing to do with a pun on a German phrase which somebody had suggested about, what was it, Armot Volatile. But he said no, the name of the what do you call it, the factory, the plumbing works that had produced the particular model that he chose was Mott Ironworks. Mott Ironworks, but he also, M-O-T-T, I think, but he also had in mind a famous cartoon character called Mutt and Jeff, and so he's having a game, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, hi. I have a question, a little bit different than the other questions. You said that they had such a bond between them. Has anybody ever considered the fact that the age gap between them, maybe he was a form of father figure? Because he didn't like Andre Breton because he kind of reminded him of his father, and the relationship with them might be the fact that he might have seen him, and because they have so much in common. Is that possible?
Do you know, I know exactly what you're saying, and certainly Dalí often writes about his own obsession with father figures, such as his own father, Picasso, and God. But he's, but I think in the case of Duchamp, it's a much more equal, despite the fact there was this gap in, there's an age gap. I think it was much more a real friendship, actually. I think for example, they're interested in eroticism, they're interested in the skeptical approach to science, and that's what I feel. Though there are accounts of which actually rather reverse that idea of some of Duchamp's sort of great admirers and acolytes going to visit him in cateches in the late 50s and early 60s, people like John Cage and Richard Hamilton. And they would go along, and Dalí would say, oh, would you like to meet, Duchamp would say, would you like to meet Dalí? Let's go and have dinner. And they said, oh, no, we don't have anything to do with him. Time when Dalí was really persona non grata in the art world, completely. But finally, John Cage agreed to go and said afterwards that he was amazed by the way that Duchamp sort of sat there and listened to Dalí talking, as though Dalí was the older man, full of wisdom, and he, Duchamp, was the one just sitting at the feet and listening, which is rather curious. I mean, I've never heard that from anybody else than Cage. But so I don't know if that's true. I think they just enjoyed themselves a lot.
Eroticism was such a big facet of each of their works, and in Dalí's case, it was almost as if he was advertising his own sexuality through his work. What would you say about Duchamp's take on eroticism? I don't know anything about his sexuality. Was it a reflection of his own, or just a comment on eroticism in general?
It's interesting. He certainly had a lot of girlfriends with whom he had very close relationships. People said that everybody fell in love with Duchamp. He was somebody of immense charm and sweetness. That's not to suggest anything really, but except that I think he really was interested in the erotic, and he talks about believing in eroticism. He had a very, very close friendship with Henri Pierre Rocher. In New York in the First World War, there was a very lively group, including a lot of women, and they all had a lovely time. That's sort of sexual. That's all I can say. And Rocher's diaries are absolutely scandalous. I mean, they're amazing. But he says a lot about their relationships with the girls and the women at the time. And I should add here, so this is actually going slightly off the point, but Duchamp was very aware that the avant-garde in New York at the time was very feminist in character. And he liked that, and he responded to it. And I see him as a kind of feminist, actually.
seems to me that Dalí lived out his worldview. First surrealism, exposing himself, then his unconscious and himself, I guess. But anyway, and then he returns to Catholicism, and that he was following a worldview, lived it out in his art. Duchamp and John Cage, who said random chance, if life is random and chance, you can't play chess. And if life is random and chance, and Cage had followed that out, he might have died on the floor of his kitchen, clutching his stomach after eating the wrong mushroom. Could you comment? Because it seems to me Dalí is living out his worldview, that Cage and Duchamp are saying it's all random, but then they don't live that out. No chess, wrong mushroom.
I don't know. What do you think?
I don't think Duchamp would have proposed chance as a way of life. I think chance was a way of disrupting certain kinds of, certainties, certain kinds of rationalities, and so on. So I think he introduced chance, and he talked about canned chance. So chance had to be organized. It was done according to certain rules. You set up, like an experiment. It was very scientific, actually. Many scientific experiments, you don't know what's going to happen at the end. So to an extent, although you may think there's a path from there to there, you're not at all sure that it's going to go the way you think it is. So chance is always a part of even the most organized and apparently rational scientific experiments. That's what I would say about Duchamp and his use of chance. Dalí, I don't know that he was that interested in chance, though he was certainly interested in the unconscious, and in things coming to him at night and in his dreams. So.
Did Duchamp have a sort of coherent cosmology about, or did he make it up as he went along, or what exactly would you say?
He didn't like God. Yeah. He said he'd rather not actually get into that sort of discussion at all. So he was a complete Cartesian from that point of view. I mean, he was, this is the world and this is all we've got, sort of thing. Okay. The question of Dalí and religion is a much more complicated one. Yeah. And I'm not at all sure that in the end he really did believe, but that's my view. But, no.
There's that passage where Duchamp he says something like, it's probably from a dialogue, or he says something like, they ask him about sort of religion, and he's like, well, I'm not really interested in religion, and nor am I interested in atheism. He says something like, he's asked in an interview something about religion, and Duchamp says, well, I'm not really interested in religion, and I'm not really interested in atheism. I would say I'm more interested in the absence of a position on this question.
Yes, that's exactly it. In the same way that he talked about art and anti-art. And he said anti-art is just the other side of the same coin. What he prefers is the term an art, that is, no art at all.
So, and he liked these sort of, he talked about indifference and sort of detachment, and this was an idea related to skepticism, the idea that you didn't want to sort of fall into the trap of judgment, you wanted to kind of avoid judgment, and kind of find a kind of ambiguous space that sort of got away from those sort of problems of yes, no, black and white, or whatever.
There were a couple of questions asked about eroticism, and I don't want this question to be necessarily interpreted that way. Do we know anything about Duchamp's relationship with Gala? How they got along?
Oh, Duchamp's relationship with Gala. We don't, but it's a very interesting question, because they, we only know they played chess together. She was a good chess player, a clever woman. She must have known Duchamp long before she met Dalí, because he was part of that Surrealist circle from when he got back in, when was it, 1920, 1919? 1921, Ernst came to Paris and had a close relationship with Paul Éluard and Gala, and Duchamp would have known her then, but I don't know. As far as I know, there is no other no other sort of known connection between them. Good question there.
I'm just throwing this out there, just refers back to the Dalí, seeing his father, Duchamp. Dalí was obsessed with his dead older brother, Salvador Dalí. I've seen, resemblance in their looks. I mean, maybe he saw something of his older dead brother. I'm just throwing that out there.
Well, I mean, his brother, you mean Duchamp? Duchamp or Dalí?
No, Dalí, being obsessed with his old brother who died named Salvador. Dalí, may have seen, projected some of that onto Duchamp, because he was an older brother of age.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, 'cause I think there's nobody else I could think of who, in a sense, could be seen to occupy that position in Dalí's life. So it's quite an interesting thought. Mm.
I just had one other question about, I know he was married to Teeny at the end. Was he married other times as well?
Yes.
How many wives did he have?
One, very brief. 1926. It's a very tricky question, actually, because no, it's all right. It was a marriage that was organised by his great friend and a slightly sort of wicked person called Francis Picabia. And Picabia had a friend who had a daughter who needed to get married off. It was quite a wealthy bourgeois. Duchamp was very short of money. And they did get married. They got married. They even rented an apartment somewhere. And Duchamp agreed to move the furniture from his tiny little, extremely modest room to this apartment. By the second day, he'd moved it all back to his studio. He just couldn't. And they did go on a sort of honeymoon to the south of France, but Duchamp spent all his time playing in chess tournaments. And actually, the marriage lasted about 3 weeks. so that he was married before. It was an attempt to sort of settle himself down and be able to work without worrying about money. He just couldn't. So that was the end of that. And then he had a very, very passionate affair with a woman called Maria Martins, who is the model for Eton Donné. And she was actually the wife of the Brazilian ambassador in New York. And she was also an artist. But that went on in the sort of 40s, early 40s. And then he met Tini Matisse, and they were very happily married for the rest of his life.
And there was, he was with somebody in the 30s.
Yes,
also,
actually,
they
yes,
weren't married.
No, but the wonderful little photographs that we found of the holiday in 1933 to Cadaqués shows Duchamp and his then girlfriend called Mary Reynolds, who was also a very independent woman. She was a bookbinder. And he was close to her for a long time, up until her death, I think, in the late 30s. Yes, but that's the other woman. There's Gala, Dalí, Duchamp, and Mary Reynolds in those photographs.
And then Tini was married to Matisse, right?
And, Tini was married to Pierre Matisse, who was Henri Matisse's son, a dealer in New York. Yeah.
Okay.
Before
Before.
Duchamp.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
I think we ought to finish.
I think so. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the exhibition.